Our season continues at the helm of the Star Forge. Inside the room where Natabre, Ahsoka, Zala, and a semi-prepared Kit Fisto were. Anakin was not present. He was lying down inside of Natabre's chambers instead of Admiral Coburn's Venator. It was something the two of them agreed upon. She had a couple of personal belongings, ones that held light within them. They were related artifacts, due to her family having been a part of the Order for 543 years. And they were some pretty priceless heirlooms, things that aunts, uncles, cousins, and whatnot had used to heal themselves. There was a generational trauma held within them, but they now only carried how each member of the family surpassed these Jedi trials. The trauma wasn't a burden, but a gift, because what it wasn't their loss and pain, rather their success and triumph. Natabre had given Anakin a charm, one that she gently wrapped around his neck when he was sleeping on the bed. One of her aunts had struggled deeply from the loss of a Padawan or something related to that. She had to succeed through her own meditations and freeing of nightmares. While Natabre and Anakin had used this necklace before, it never did the job. She assumed that it was because Anakin wasn't ever sleeping, surrounded by the rest of the light-sided artifacts. Just as a precaution though, Waxer and Boyle were stationed outside of the quarters to keep an eye on Anakin if he ever arose from his sleep in a panic. So far, everything was silent, and the family heirloom that belonged to Natabre was aiding Anakin with his sleep. Morden's family hailed from Stujon, similar to Obi-Wan. It hadn't really ever been a frame of reference for either Jedi, and Natabre never believed it was a big deal. Anakin knew, but as she believed, it wasn't a big difference maker in his mind. Natabre's family was able to persist inside the Jedi Order because the original patriarch and matriarch of the family had around 14 children. It wasn't split down the middle, but out of the initial batch were 2 that became Jedi. Ever since their acceptance into the Order, the family had become a staple for Jedi to teach. Sometimes the younglings and Padawans would be taught by related family members, but it wasn't super uncommon for multiple members of the same family to be a part of the Old Order at the same time. Regardless, Natabre was standing with her arms down by her hips, drifting lazily from side to side as she listened to the report from High Command. Master Fister watched with interest as the Admiral speaking disclosed information about the catastrophic loss at Velmor. Master Agan Kolar informed this Admiral so that the rest of the military could be alerted to such disturbance. Natabre shot Fisto a look before turning back to the front of the hollow table. The commanders, Jedi generals, and admirals were speaking amongst themselves about the future of their movement and how they would address this concern. It was becoming clearer than ever, especially with losses at Crownest and Velmor, that the Sith were making their move for Mandalore, and it was only a matter of time until they hit the fortress planet. Natabre stepped forward and Kit tried to grab her wrist, but she slipped away from his hand without even realizing it. Fisto was still a little aloof after his miniature Barash vow. Everyone on the communication call silenced themselves as they allowed General Morden to speak. She spoke passionately but held reservation. She told them that she understood how important it was for the Republic to maintain secrecy over their Star Destroyers, but if they wanted to win this war and rally more systems like Mandalore to just revolt, then she was willing to volunteer herself. Natabre stepped back and filled in the blanks of her initial statement. She was a little too excited. Now she had the chance to finish her statement, but with better articulation. She smiled to herself and told them that the Sith were running rampant across their lines, and it was time they did something. She expressed that with their permission, Admiral Coburn's fleet, alongside the command of herself and General Skywalker, would be the perfect unit to dispatch into the Eastern Quadrant. There was a grumble from one of the officers. They knew they were with the Star Forge, and that was simply too far away for them to transport themselves across Republic battle lines and get themselves to Agan's former position. Natabre looked at Kit Fisto, who nodded his head, seeing the datapad strewn across the table. She excused the Admiral with all due respect and told him that they had fleets in the area. By her latest reports, there were fleets stationed not more than a couple parsecs away from Velmor. She continued, even though they weren't large fleets, it was believed, at least according to Master Kolar, that this was a premeditated attack. The Sith were waiting for their chance to strike at Velmor, and they finally did. Did High Command really believe that the Sith would strike again so soon? They were trying to spread out the Republic. When the Sith took control over Zaheth, they got control over a long-range scanner, and were able to see their lines. They needed to react. If they couldn't scrounge up the forces to do it, then at least allow a successful force to recapture Velmor so they could at the very least, open up the trade route again. These were desperate times, and these desperate measures would need to be taken so that they could win this war. This trade route was incredibly important for support on the Eastern Quadrant past Mandalore. High Command sanctioned the mission, but they needed to leave almost immediately. It was imperative they get this finished. She acknowledged before silencing her side of the communication and turning to Master Fisto. He nodded his head in acceptance of her strong stance. He spoke up, telling her that she had done well, even though he almost tried to stop her. He then explained that he would walk her to the hangar bay so that they could get her to her assignment. She thanked him and they walked together. Behind them, before they exited the command deck, there was the star that was about to die. They had finally arrived at System 9Z1, and the Forge was preparing its energy core. The system would be dormant very soon. Admiral Coburn, who was on the call, was delegating a piece of his fleet to stay as a defense here until the Forge created a new fleet, or whatever High Command agreed upon. Zala and Ahsoka watched the two Jedi Masters walk through the door. They turned and watched the sun in the distance. Zala told her friend that maybe it wasn't the worst thing in the galaxy. Ahsoka put her hand on her friend's shoulder and told her that there was nothing wrong with changing her opinion, but if she truly didn't believe it, then there was no reason to stand her ground on it. Zala smiled and thanked Ahsoka, but she did mean it. She wasn't conforming to fit in. She truly did believe that the death of this star could save 1,000,000, billion, trillion, or even quadrillion lives. Fisto and the Tabre walked through the door and stopped in the elevator as it drifted down towards the hangar bay level. He told her that he wanted her to know he almost abandoned the Jedi Order. This was not to put pressure on her, but rather to thank her and General Skywalker for their efforts. They were a breath of fresh air. They were what the Jedi Order desired, and while it might not have seemed that way, they were everything the Jedi needed right now. The Tabre did appreciate it, but why? Fisto stepped out first and led her down the hall. He told her that they were young and vibrant. The Order had fallen down due to its age, and in an era where not many of the old guard still remained, it was imperative for the Jedi to regard their future generation with precedence. So many admirals, generals, and Republic officers would stomp all over them, but she stood her ground. She made sure that admiral didn't try and place her in some rudimentary position to keep her troops inactive, one that wouldn't assist the Republic in this war effort. Kit expressed somberly that it felt as if some of the military leaders for their alliance didn't like the Jedi. Some would rather not have them at all, and in that situation, the Republic might as well be lost. The burden of this war fell onto the next generation, because it was a war that could not have been won by the elder one. Fisto came to recognize that it was in the hubris of an older generation that allowed this to come, regardless of how natural or unnatural all of this really was. He thanked her for her servitude to the Republic, and he wished that the Force be with her and her students on this journey. And he wished General Skywalker speedy recovery from his nightmares. Natabre smiled very widely and bowed to the Jedi Master, wishing that the Force be with him as well, before walking into an LAAT gunship. She waited for Zala and Ahsoka to run in and greet her. They had been silent, and she was glad the two of them had a moment to themselves inside the command center. The LAAT lifted off and returned to the flagship, where the three Jedi quickly moved about. The Tabre would meet Admiral Coburn inside the bridge and speak with him about anything else she may have missed from the rest of the session. He told her everything she needed to know, a little jibber-jabber, nothing more than the normal bureaucratic-type discussion they'd grown accustomed to. Coburn prepared the fleet and began moving it into position. Before they left, Skywalker jolted through the bridge doors and told them to stop. Coburn and Natabre turned back and asked what it was. He opened up a hologram, one he was gripping with his bare hand, knowing the metallic one would have crushed it in a state of panic. He held it forward and showed it to them. He said that the entire planet of Naboo was crumbling. Coburn confusedly looked to Natabre, who asked Anakin what had happened. He expressed that there was a Sith attack. He was laying in his room aimlessly scrolling through the data pad when he saw a new report pop up. The Sith struck the system randomly. Naboo was pretty defenseless. There was a clone outpost on the planet, but nothing remotely as important as a long-range scanner placed at Sith. He told them that they were moving east, right? Well, if they were, couldn't they afford to pop a Sith fleet? Coburn pursed his lips, looking to the communication table and past it, at the information wall. He looked at the size of the fleet they were going to Naboo with. They would be able to destroy the Sith that were present, and move on with little to no problem. He compared it mentally to the death of Captain Wildnut of Pax. Of course, they were still under the belief that his fleet was destroyed by the Sith, but Coburn believed he would overwhelm anything the Sith had at Naboo. He told the two Jedi that he was agreeing to this mission, but they wouldn't be able to do anything for the refugees of the planet. They might be able to leave an acclimator behind to help people from the surface to one of the refugee camps, but that's about it. Coburn turned to the rest of the fleet and told them to prepare to jump to hyperspace. They were heading towards Naboo. While in hyperspace, there wasn't much but just planning. The reports were still coming back from Naboo. The only thing that continued to evade them was the size of the enemy fleet. Anakin hypothesized that it was the ghost from Thifera, and the Tabre believed it was possible. But similar to their worries from before, it couldn't be him. The individual they continued referring to, in their minds, wasn't the tactical genius. While he was known to be capable of destroying entire worlds, this was not the same. Unless he became some sort of fire-breathing demagogue, then this wasn't him. Nihilus would have just killed the entire planet himself, absorbing it into his quest for hunger. But this was a calculated attack. It was becoming clearer than ever that no longer were the Sith united by an emperor without direction. They were led by someone who wanted to control everything and everyone, without doing so at the expense of his or her own power. They planned up a counter for whatever the Sith could have planned for them at the system. The Tabre privately told Anakin to keep his head focused. She remembered how close he and Padme were before the war started. She knew returning to a destroyed version of Padme's home would be difficult for him. Anakin nodded his head, promising her that he would keep his wits about him during this assault. They were simply here to save the people of this planet. That was all that mattered. Ahsoka and Zala were patiently waiting inside their starships. Zala's eyes were closed, and Ahsoka kept her hand on the control yoke, watching the hangar bay doors, waiting for the first creak to signal that they had arrived. Anakin and the Tabre walked over to their vessels and got in, waiting patiently. Not more than 5 minutes after they got there, they dropped out of hyperspace, and the hangar doors opened, and they lifted up their starfighters and shot off into the air. Behind them followed their escorts. The Tabre took point today. Anakin was still walking off some of his nightmares, and there had been an evident lack of sleep for him since the previous installment of terror inside the Forge. Skywalker spun away from the 3 Jedi starfighters, as was planned. He led a group of V-19s, and Y-Wings trailed behind him, as they pressed into what they thought would be flak, but there was nothing. Simply a lonely starship floating aimlessly above the planet of Naboo. Their immediate instinct was Darth Nihilus, the Ghost. They would destroy that ship. Coburn moved his fleet in cautiously, as the fighters sped forward. Anakin and his unit dipped down towards the surface of the planet, and as soon as they breached the atmosphere, the trap was set. A Sith fleet deployed, blasting away at the Republic fighters that quickly took evasive action. Darth Desolus helmed the lead ship in the fleet, as he yelled out orders to his worthless deckhands. He smiled, telling them to deploy wings of fighters to capture the lone Jedi starfighter. The yellow vessel belonged to their target. As he prided himself on this trap, he looked forward and saw something he had never seen before. He demanded that the deckhands give him information on that new battleship. The Republic fleet was led by Coburn, opting to use his Venator as his flagship, but that was flanked by 3 Republic Star Destroyers. Coburn, now for the first time, would be able to see their effectiveness in combat. Not only was this Coburn's first task with these vessels, but it was the first time anyone in the galaxy aside from the Republic had seen a Star Destroyer. Darth Desolus readied his fleet for counter, as the fighters sped after Anakin. Natabre called out, telling him that he was being trailed. He acknowledged, as she ordered the 2 Padawans to lead the fighters back to the fleet and defend it. She was going to back up Anakin. An ace pilot or 2 rallied behind Natabre, as the rest of the fighters broke back towards the fleet. Heavy fire fled the turbo lasers on the Venators and the Star Destroyers. The Republic battleships creeped forward and unloaded their heavy cannons. The Sith fleet was completely unprepared as they tried to raise their shields to combat it, and this failed fantastically. Darth Desolus started to panic, seeing that he was completely outmatched. His attack was brilliant, What wasn't brilliant was how unprepared his fleet was for this Republic assault. Decius told his men to reroute their fleet and retreat to the closest Sith territory. The Star Destroyers unloaded even heavier barrages into the Sith vessels. To call this a rout wasn't even scratching the surface of the pure disrespect levied against the Sith Lord. Coburn from the bridge could see all of this coming together now. This was how they could win this war. The Jedi couldn't see it from their vantage point, but Coburn would have to tell them all about the pure brilliance of these destroyers. His communication to Republic High Command after this battle would be praising the creation of these vehicles. They were the key to everything. He stepped towards the edge of the bridge and smiled to himself, his eyes locked onto the Sith destroyers. They pulled in all sorts of direction, fire blasting out of their bows, sterns, and ports. It was brilliant. He could even see individual starfighters try and break free from the destruction of the vessels, but they too were vaporized. The Tabre bursted through a shredded hull of one of the destroyers that sat in two separate pieces, giving her a chance to speed through it with her two ace pilots, allowing them to avoid any trailing Sith starfighter craft, which there were none of. Anakin sped over the surface of Theed. It was burning. He could see people running out for cover as they saw Republic starships. They cheered. They had been saved. Before, a wave of blaster shots riddled the ground near the citizens. They ran in fear. The clones behind Anakin pulled away and turned back. The Y-Wing sped forward, trying to avoid being hit. But it was clear the Sith had changed their targets. With the fleet abandoning the system, they were instructed to kill anyone still remaining on the surface. Without any true defense for Naboo, they were helpless. Anakin cut the engines, ripping the yoke backwards and allowing the ship to drop down towards the surface over the waterfall. He flipped the engines back on after gravity pulled him down and launched himself towards the Sith fighters. His blasters opened fire and a dogfight commenced. Surrounding him were the other Republic fighters that had broken free. As Anakin cut through his opposition, the Tabre and the two ace pilots jolted down from the ash-covered sky. The orange haze of the atmosphere was horrific to the sight, but once she saw the blaster fire, she signaled to the ace pilots to do as much damage as they possibly could, and they did. Anakin continued pouring blaster fire forward, and the Tabre sped down, avoiding him as they split off into opposite directions, their fire covering the rear and front of different Sith fighters, as they obliterated in the air. The other Republic fighters cleaned up the rest of the mess, as Admiral Coburn deployed an acclimator and a couple corvettes to run a rescue mission on the surface. Clones moved down past the fighters that returned to Admiral Coburn's flagship and the other carriers. Anakin was one of those fighters, and he sat inside of his starship idly, taking in all of what he had seen on the planet. The lush green beauty that he had fallen in love with was decimated. Naboo would heal, but the Sith had run carpet-bombing operations across the entire planet, not just the city. It seemed as if Darth Decius was intent on making his mark. Obviously, he had his own issues to report to the Sith Emperor, because what he had encountered on Naboo was not normal. Those ships were larger than anything he had ever seen before. The Tabre, also inside the flagship's hangar, congratulated Ahsoka and Zala on their work well done. They excelled in the face of danger, especially one like the trap that had been laid on them. She told them that they were free from Padawan exercises for the day. Zala asked why they were having so much time away from their Padawan studies, and the Tabre told her that, as a unit, they had to operate in coalition with all of their members. When one of them is hurt, they must rally around them to pick them up. She was helping Master Anakin with that, referring to him as a rank that the students would refer to him as. She understood their interest in learning and appreciated their dedication to their studies, but they would continue soon. She just requested that she had their patience. The students bowed to their master, and she did the same before moving over to Anakin's starfighter and knocking on the window. He opened the cockpit as he looked to her. He didn't say much. She could see his jaw flexing, like he was trying to hold back some sort of emotion. She leaned over and told him that he could tell her what was on his mind. Anakin didn't have much to say about Naboo in particular. He just told her that they needed to win this war. They had to get the Coruscant or Kuat or Corellia. They needed to seize the core and end this, because no system should face that terror. What the Sith had done was outrageous, and they had tortured a civilization into rubble. Anakin told her that he wasn't seeking revenge, and she knew that, but he wanted the Sith to be stopped. He leaned forward and she reached out her hand, helping him off his starfighter. Even though it wasn't necessary, the courtesy was appreciated, as he let their hands linger together for a short moment. The Jedi generals made their way to the bridge, where they found an ecstatic Admiral Coburn. Neither Jedi had ever seen him so lively. He was on a communication with the Republic High Command. He informed them that they broke protocol to stop a Sith attack at Naboo. They were running a rescue mission as they spoke. Coburn also informed them that the main fleet would not be waiting at Naboo. Their mission mandate was still a top priority, which was why he deployed a splinter group. He informed them that the Republic Star Destroyers needed to be used immediately. It would be the key to winning this war. He had seen it himself. They were lured into a trap, one that, had they only had their Venators, they would have struggled with. But these destroyers, only 3 of them, mind you, were able to decimate the Sith and send them cowering within minutes. It was jarring to say the least. A secretary noted down everything Coburn said, as one of the generals spoke up and commended their service. This would be a defining moment for their war effort. The general sadly didn't consider if the Sith escaped. Naturally, everyone in the room thought that the Sith were completely destroyed, and Coburn was really too excited to recall their escape. The call ended shortly after the Jedi arrived, and Coburn quickly showed the Jedi the wreckage field, before everything turned blue and the fleet departed for Velmor. The Jedi were surprised that these vessels had been so effective. From the viewport of a starfighter, it was a little harder to see these things, but from their point of view inside the bridge before they left, it was remarkable. The Tabre was the one to ask, though. What would Coburn be doing in regard to his flagship? She meant this in the inquisitive manner of whether or not he'd be keeping his flagship a Venator or a new destroyer. Coburn didn't struggle. He was keeping the Venator as the lead ship. The rationale for this, in his mind, was the fact that the Venator was the heart of the fleet. Being that it did carry all the fighters and support craft, it was necessary for their victories. The Star Destroyers, in his mind, could place their long-range cannons right behind the Venator line and shred whatever opposed them. It was a sound strategy. Over Shardan, Darth Desolus' fleet limped out of hyperspace. He gritted his teeth with a disgusted scowl. He told the deckhand to contact the Sith Emperor on Coruscant, send the transmission to his quarters ASAP. The man got to work doing as the Sith Lord asked. Desolus stomped his way back to his chambers and opened the door, watching an oversized hologram of Emperor Valkorn appear over him. Desolus knelt down. He pressed his hands to his knee and looked at the floor, bowing his head. The Supreme Leader asked for an update on Project Skyfall. Desolus shook his head, telling Valkorn that their trap failed. He apologized bluntly. The Pa'an Sith's eyes moved up to see Valkorn sitting silently, his hands glued to his throne, his breathing as still as a statue, and his eyes fixated on the Sith assigned to this project. Desolus told Valkorn that he did not fail with malice. He tried to combat the Jedi, that they were over-prepared. Valkorn repeated the 2 final words back to the Sith. Desolus nodded their head. He told him that the Republic had crafted larger star vessels. They were double, maybe even triple the size of the Venators. Their cannons had longer ranges and they were able to crush their forces. The Sith fleet over Naboo had the upper hand because they had the element of surprise, but that didn't even matter. Once the destroyers opened up their full range of firepower, they had already lost. Valkorn let out an almost pleasing He told Desolus that he had done well. Valkorn could feel a wave of relief pass through Desolus' body. He sighed deeply and looked up. The Supreme Leader hadn't changed his position. His eyes were still locked on the same place. Valkorn spoke aloud, as if he were speaking to himself and Desolus wasn't more than a fly on the wall. If the Jedi had truly utilized the Star Forge, then they likely gained access to Exar's blueprints, whatever it was he had designed up. Exar never shared with anyone, so the only chance to achieve victory over the Republic was to steal one of these vessels. Desolus looked on with curiosity, before Valkorn changed the topic and asked about Skywalker. Desolus told him that the young Jedi evaded them, but he went straight for the planet as Valkorn predicted. The Supreme Leader nodded his head, with a resounding very well. This was a victory in his mind. He thanked Desolus and told him to return to the closest shipyard to repair his fleet. They would need him at full strength so that they could win this war together. Desolus bowed and the hologram ended. Valkorn sat in silence, waiting for the hum of the transmission to cut. Like various other Sith, they were planning to capture Skywalker. Valkorn had spent time inside the former Jedi Temple when no one was around. He played a hunch, and it seemed to be right. Valkorin found that the second to last mission assigned by the High Council was the deployment of Anakin Skywalker to Naboo with Senator Amidala. This was an on-record mission, of course. The other mission was of course the deployment of 200 Jedi to Geonosis, but the point being, Valkorin understood that someone like Skywalker could be dangerous. While the Republic believed the Star Destroyer was the key to winning everything, Valkorin understood that the true key to everything was a 19-year-old Jedi Knight, co-commanding one of the most important units in the Republic military. Valkorin thought to himself some more. Project Skyfall was the capture and/or killing of Anakin Skywalker. If he could be lured to Naboo, on a hunch about a soon-to-be-dead senator Valkorin didn't know or care, then there were other emotional cues the Sith could use to draw him in. Anakin wouldn't be naive enough to fall for a Thifera incident again, but he might be drawn into a major scuffle, one like the battle at Naboo. But instead of an unprepared fleet, they'd have something ready, a counter, a means to destroy a vessel of such magnitude. This brought Valkorin back to another piece of information. His voice rang out to his guards below him. They turned and looked up in his direction. He told them to get into contact with the other Sith. They were going to retaliate. He wasn't sure how they would do it, but at the very least, to ensure they continued to build off the established trust between himself and the other Sith, he needed to communicate to them, to inform them. He wanted to be a supreme leader. He needed to earn it, with the trust of the other Sith Lords. Already proven with Desolus and varied others, it was clear that only through furthering their trust in him could he garner more influence over them. Arriving outside of the wreckage field of Agan Kohler's fleet was the Skywalker Morden team. Their fleet scanned the debris, and scouts were sent out to search around the star system. Due to the previous battle, the Jedi and Coburn were even more wary of potential counterattacks and unwanted surprises. Anakin, Natabre, and Coburn stood over the communication table. Cody walked into the bridge with a hollow pad in his hand, and told them that the Sith had vanished. There was a sense of confusion, and the clone commander seized the silence. He theorized that the Sith had come to disrupt the trade routes. There were skirmishes popping up across the battle lines, throughout the mid-rim and even into the outer rim. This obviously wasn't a separatist attack, but there were reports that the Sith and CIS had been engaging in their own combative missions. Ever since the reported potential conflict at Lannick, there were more movements from the separatists. This had also been disclosed in a recent debriefing. Cody tapped the communication table and it shot up a blue hazy hologram. He scanned it before speaking, making sure it was showing everything he wanted to show. It was a piece of the galactic map, with a show of patterns. He also acknowledged how they had been cross-checking information from the reserve drive of the old Jedi Temple, and they were picking up on tactics, logos, and even identifications of the Sith Lords. The reason Cody found this to be of an importance was because, aside from the race to the Star Forge, it was uncommon for Sith Lords or Darths to even be seen leading battles. Another hologram popped up, and Cody informed them that they were ambushed by Darth Desolus. All of these had to be connected, and Cody reaffirmed that it was clear the Sith were continuing their headhunting strategy. But because the Confederacy was responding with hostility, the Sith were clearly trying to strike revenge. If they could wipe out the entirety of the Separatist movement, then what would they have to worry about aside from the Republic? Cody believed the Sith were trying to drain trade routes, forcing Republic-controlled systems to revolt against the Republic itself, which is why they hit Velmor. Clearly, this wasn't going to happen, but he continued pointing to Mandalore. He said disrupting these trade routes would cause dissension. The attack on Naboo was clearly meant to drag Skywalker out into combat, and of course, there was worry for the eventual attack at Mandalore, a key system that the Republic could not afford to lose. Cody thought that these were all connected in some way, but he wasn't exactly sure what it was that connected them. He suggested that in an effort to retain their control over everything, they needed to move deeper in. Coburn countered this and asked if that would be another trap in the making. Cody didn't believe so. He pointed to Velmor, behind them. They hadn't been blitzed yet. Cody asked General Skywalker if there was a reason for the connection to Naboo, and without any reason to hide it, he told them he escorted Senator Amidala to Naboo before Geonosis. It was officially recorded by the High Council. Anakin believed that the Sith were targeting Naboo to pull him in, which seemingly worked. Cody shrugged and gestured forward, basically saying, He was right. The attack at Belmore was just to disrupt their lines. They weren't staying here, and the Republic didn't have the resources to sacrifice out here for the potential of another battle. The clone commander then asked if there was any personal connection to Mandalore that the Sith would know about, and Anakin shook his head. He had been to Mandalore, but that was before ever being assigned to an official military rank. It was likely a couple months before their headhunting game even began, so Anakin wasn't on their radar at the time, at least in his mind. Cody didn't believe there was enough evidence present to suggest that the Sith were trying to drag Skywalker into a match at Mandalore or around it. Natabre questioned Cody and Coburn, asking if there were any other outposts outside of Mandalore, aside from Crownest. They both shook their heads. Coburn pointed at the map and told her that their best bet was to move into the territory near General Saesee Tin's fleet. His finger traced a line on the map from Velmore to Ord Cestus. From there, they could divide up their fleet. The two Jedi nodded in agreement, so they waited for their scouts to return, informing them that they were in the clear. Coburn deployed 3 Pelta-class frigates. They were being housed inside the hangars of the Star Destroyers. They weren't really capable of fighting vehicles, but similar to Naboo, Coburn was making a point of emphasis to ensure the Republic knew their territory was under control. The support fleet at Naboo was necessary. The 3 Peltas here were necessary. The trade routes that went through Velmore were critical for the Republic war effort, and for the refugees of the war. Coburn also deployed the sister ship to the flagship, leaving behind 1 Venator and 3 Peltas. It would make sure all traveling traders would be able to get to locations they needed to get to. Coburn then ordered the rest of the fleet prepare for the jump into hyperspace. During this segment of the trip, Anakin and Natabre gave Ahsoka and Zala the chance to choose if they wanted a lesson, so they implemented their training regiment. The first half was very physical, and the second half was more meditative. Everyone was tired at the moment, and there was no need to make anyone even more tired, so their training was more like a light practice session, with a long cooldown. It maybe wasn't what the girls were looking for, but it was what they needed, even though they couldn't quite wrap their minds around that aspect yet. After several hours of long travel through hyperspace, the Jedi arrived at Ord Cestus, but there was a problem. The Sith had engaged in a firefight with Master Tin's navy. He was holding them off, but this fleet was huge, and it was battle-tested. Saesee Tin was piloting his starfighter, while the rest of his battle force struggled against the likes of a super tactician. Similar to the fate that claimed the Republic captain over Pax, Saesee's captain wasn't extremely experienced. He was simply filling the ranks because that's what the Republic could afford to do. When Coburn's fleet dropped out of hyperspace, they blindsided Lord Revan and Darth Malak. The Second Republic fleet in this battle popped up in the middle of the flank, so Revan's forces were pressed into countering this new battle group, while also holding off the original one. But Revan was capable. He stood on the bridge and didn't hesitate as he issued out orders to his troops. They reacted immediately. In the middle of the battle lines was a dogfight. Saesee Tin was leading it for the Republic, and he was winning it, as one of the best pilots the Order had to offer. Anakin looked into Natabre, Zala, and Ahsoka, waving them on and telling them to get into their starfighters. They ran with him from the bridge, as Coburn assumed control over his fleet. The Star Destroyers were lined up in a horizontal flank, creating an impenetrable wall of massive ships. The Venators hovered over them, with support cruisers and corvettes lingering in between them to use their point defense systems and smaller cannons to deter fighter attacks. By the time Coburn's fleet reached its position, the 4 Jedi were in their starfighters and following the rest of the Republic fighters into battle. Saesee was holding off his enemies, but the Sith were clearly refusing to leave. Revan had moved the fleet into a perfect position. They were able to trade blows with an already damaged Republic fleet that belonged to Saesee, while also avoiding the heavy strikes from these new destroyers. Revan was still working on his plans of countering these vessels, but this was a temporary fix until he came up with a new one. He then turned to his apprentice and told Malak to hold the line. He was going to go kill a Jedi. Master Tin was a counselor that was wanted dead by the Sith, but because Revan was aware of Project Skyfall, he was going after what was presumably Anakin's fleet, because he saw a yellow starfighter barreling down towards a dogfight. Whether it was killing Anakin or capturing and killing Natabre to draw Skywalker towards him, it didn't matter. His point stood. It was about breaking the key to this war. Revan moved from the bridge of the flagship and down to the hangar bay, where he shot off. Malak assumed control over the bridge and followed Revan's laid-out strategy to a T. The Republic watched this. Admiral Coburn assumed control over the battlefront from the captain that was leading Stacey's fleet. Coburn moved the 3 destroyers closer to the dogfight in the middle. Stacey could see reinforcement fighters coming his way, and he locked into his battle with the Sith fighters. The trouble with fighting Revan was the fact that he had numerous Sith acolytes and marauders within his ranks, so they were able to ferry active Force users into space combat, making this fight even more challenging for Stacey and especially for the clones, because the clone pilots were great, but they weren't always going to be able to defeat the Sith forces in aerial combat. Stacey pulled back around. Behind him flew Sith fighters, ones intercepted by Natabre. As Anakin dove headfirst into battle, Zala and Ahsoka kept close to each other, as they always did. Their struggle in the battlefront was the same as it was for the clones. These Sith pilots were experienced, and they used the Force to their advantage. The only reason the clones were winning this dogfight was because of their superior numbers. Anakin could then see a new wing of Sith coming his way, so he lobbed himself out of the dogfight and informed his team where he was going. They all acknowledged. Natabre sped behind Stacey, cutting through the few Sith fighters who were chasing him. What made things difficult for clone and Jedi pilots was the fact that the Sith and their troopers all flew the same ship, so there was absolutely nothing distinguishable about Force users and just Sith troopers, aside from their skills. Anakin flipped his ship from side to side, as R2 whirred in his astromech slot of the ship. Flak slammed around his starfighter, but Anakin handled himself expertly, slipping and ducking as he rolled around a Sith fighter and blasting through it. When the explosion settled, he saw another starship, one not belonging to any other Sith craft. This was the Sith Lord they were looking for. This was why he came over here to counter their fighters. Behind Anakin came a wing of experienced pilots that made a perfect addition to his assault. They provided cover fire, while a dogfight commenced between the 2 lead pilots in the battle. Anakin was chased around the edge of the large dogfight. His Jedi starfighter thrusted forward as Revan trailed after him. The Sith Lord clicked the trigger and watched red blaster fire trail after Anakin's yellow starship. The Force was strong with this one. Skywalker pulled back and rolled to the right as Revan trailed him closely. In the fleet battle, the Star Destroyers continued getting closer while the Sith fleet maintained its distance. The damaged Republic Venators from before the arrival of Coburn's fleet moved behind his destroyers, so that they could lick their wounds and hopefully survive this battle. Natabre, as she was pulling around to clip a Sith acolyte out of the sky, could see Anakin whipping his ship around the far side of the dogfight. Behind him, Revan kept getting closer. Anakin decided to make a move, and he did. He pulled his ship around and cut the engines, similar to how he had on Naboo, except he didn't anticipate for how fast Revan's starfighter was. The Sith Lord wasn't even using its maximum potential, so when Anakin cut his engines, Revan sped up. This forced Anakin to lob a shot into the mainframe of Revan's starfighter, as Anakin's own vessel slipped around to the side, drifting a little too far. Their 2 spacecrafts slammed into each other, launching R2 out of his seat and crunching the gears of the 2 ships together. Anakin and Revan looked to each other. One of Anakin's eyebrows raised, with Revan shooting a side-eye at the young Jedi. They both tried to break free of this predicament, as they spun out of control. Zala got her master's attention and told her what she saw. As Natabre pulled her ship around to destroy Revan, and hopefully save Anakin, she watched the 2 ships click backwards. In the process of their collision, they disrupted several systems within their ships. For example, Revan's cockpit was losing air pressure. Luckily, he had a helmet, while Anakin's shot R2 out of his astromech seat. Due to Revan trying to fix the air pressure in his cockpit, he didn't realize that the hyperdrive had been triggered, and before either of the 2 of them could separate, their 2 ships, united as one, launched into hyperspace. And that, my friends, is episode 6 of the Sith Clone Wars Season 3. I'm super hyped. It's a cliffhanger. I'm so hyped for you guys. Anyways, I'll see you guys next week with the Sith Clone Wars. I love you all. Spread the love, and always, my friends, may the Force be with you.